Burke, Part 3. Defender of Liberty. In respect of his attitude towards liberty, Burke appears to be somewhat Jekyll and Hyde. There is Burke, the defender of the oppressed in Ireland, America, and India. And then there is the Burke who castigates the French Revolution. How, asked MacLelland, could such a consistent defender of American liberties turn almost overnight into the scourge of the liberties of the French? The clash between the British government and the American colonists resulted from a mutual assertion of abstract rights. On the British side, the parliamentary sovereign right to tax. On the American side, the assertion of the right to have taxation only if they had representation. Both sides were at fault, the British perhaps more so, but the case of the revolution in France was different. The only difference between the French and American cases is that the French Revolution began in the name of an ideology, while the Americans were eventually forced into ideology which made them revolutionaries. So writes MacLelland. It is often argued, and seems so to many of his contemporaries, that Burke was inconsistent inasmuch as he supported Ireland against oppression, the American colonists likewise, and the Indians against the depredations of the East India Company, but objected strongly to the revolution in France. Was he inconsistent? George Sabine thinks not. At the root of Burke's thinking was an unshakable belief that political institutions were complicated systems founded on prescription and custom, growing from the past into the future, and in which the accumulated wisdom of a people could be found. Against the common charge that Burke was inconsistent in supporting the American colonists while rejecting the French Revolution and all its works and pomps, Jesse Norman replies that, in fact, Burke accepted and gave his support to not one but 5 revolutions: the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the American War of Independence, the struggle for Corsican independence, Polish resistance to Russian intervention in 1768, and resistance to the East India Company. If this is so, what was so different about the French Revolution that merited a very different response from Burke? The revolutions or resistances that Burke supported all involved a struggle against specific wrongs, in particular against the arbitrary exercise of power. But the French Revolution was not of this kind. It was not an attempt to defend a particular way of life against aggression, but rather the wholesale destruction of particular ways of life in the pursuit of abstract and rootless rights. In the Speech on Conciliation with the Colonies, Burke had claimed that the colonists had a great attachment to liberty, but not to liberty as some ahistorical principle, but liberty as that had grown and developed in the context of English history and society. In a similar way, Burke is willing to endorse a notion of human rights, provided that they are not merely abstract, divorced from tradition, law, history, and custom. Burke has no interest in abstract rights. What are these rights? Where do they come from? Why these and only these rights? Such rights as engage his interest are the actual concrete rights embodied in political tradition and custom. He doesn't deny natural rights, but sees them as applying only to men in a pre-political condition. But men today do not live in such a condition, and it is absurd to base their conduct on rights that attach to it. Insofar as Burke is willing to recognize such things as natural rights, he recognizes them only when clothed with the forms of actual embodiment in concrete political circumstances. His image is that natural rights are like light rays that pierce a dense medium and are thereby refracted. Burke is not necessarily opposed to change, but only to radical or revolutionary change, which would have the effect of destroying the carefully cultivated garden of society and substituting in its place a ploughed field bereft of any living thing. Political change for Burke is conceived of as a kind of continuous organic growth, a change from seed to plant, from youth to age. He writes, "In this character of the Americans, a love of freedom is the predominating feature, which marks and distinguishes the whole. This fierce spirit of liberty is stronger in the English colonies probably than in any other people of the earth. They are devoted not only to liberty, but to liberty according to English ideas and on English principles. Abstract liberty, like other mere abstractions, is not to be found. George Sabine thinks that while the revolution in France did not, in essentials, change any of Burke's ideas, it did deeply unsettle him, so much so that it unbalanced his judgment, revealed hatreds that had been decently masked, and produced a flood of irresponsible rhetoric in which his impartiality, his judgment of history, and his customary mastery of facts were largely lost. Edmund Burke offers us an account of the foundations of political order that is, in essence, non-contractual. His account begins, perhaps perversely, with the claim that society is indeed a contract, which might seem to undermine my statement that his account is not contractual. But Burke's idea of this social contract is a very special one. Ordinary contracts, what Burke calls subordinate contracts for objects of mere occasional interest, concern themselves with such low matters as a partnership agreement in a trade of pepper and coffee, calico or tobacco. But the contract which concerns the very foundation of the state is not of this order. This contract, which has now inexplicably become a partnership, is to be looked on with other reverence because it is not a partnership in the thing subservient only to the gross animal existence of a temporary and perishable nature. It is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. And because the objects of this contract or partnership cannot, it seems, be achieved immediately, nor even in a few generations, it turns out to subsist not only between one living being and another, but also between the living, the dead, and the unborn. It seems that this political partnership, which has once again been returned a contract, is a species of transcendent entity of which particular political partnerships are mere local instantiations. He writes, "Each contract of each particular state is but a clause in the great primeval contract of eternal society, linking the lower with the higher natures, connecting the visible and invisible world according to a fixed compact sanctioned by the inviolable oath which holds all physical and all moral natures, each in their appointed place." The primeval and eternal partnership or contract, which has now become a compact, is, it appears, sanctioned by an inviolable oath, though what the wording of this oath is, who takes it, and when it has been or is to be taken, is mysteriously left unspecified. This partnership, contract, or compact has the further interesting characteristic that it is not subject to the will of those who, by an obligation above them and infinitely superior, are bound to submit their will to that law. The eternal and primeval contract, partnership, or compact, or law demands the submission of our wills. One may not, except under some kind of unspecified necessity that is not chosen but rather thrust upon one, refuse to submit to this contract. He writes, "The municipal corporations of that universal kingdom are not morally at liberty at their pleasure and on their speculations of a contingent improvement wholly to separate and tear asunder the bands of their subordinate community, and to dissolve it into an unsocial, uncivil, unconnected chaos of elementary principles. It is the first and supreme necessity only, a necessity that is not chosen but chooses, a necessity paramount to deliberation, that admits no discussion and demands no evidence, which alone can justify a resort to anarchy." A voluntary and rational rejection of the transcendental, eternal, and primeval contract would, according to Burke, have devastating consequences. That way, it seems, madness lies. He writes, "But if that which is only submission to necessity should be made the object of choice, the law is broken, nature is disobeyed, and the rebellious are outlawed, cast forth, and exiled from this world of reason and order and peace, and virtue, and fruitful penitence, into the antagonist world of madness, discord, vice, confusion, and unavailing sorrow." It is interesting to note that some 15 years before he wrote these words, Burke was somewhat less pessimistic about the consequences of a rejection of the transcendent political order on which he was to wax so eloquent. Then he wrote, "A new, strange, unexpected face of things appeared. Anarchy is found tolerable. A vast province has now subsisted, and subsisted in a considerable degree of health and vigour, for near a 12-month, without governor, without public council, without judges, without executive magistrates." It is hard not to be carried away on the flood tide of Burke's eloquence. An eloquence he honed, no doubt, in Trinity College's debating society, in a tradition not yet atrophied. To appreciate the passage properly requires it to be read as a unit and not piecemeal as I have presented it. To subject it to such rude analysis as I have done might seem to be taking a spade to a souffle, as someone once remarked about a critic of the writings of P.G. Wodehouse. Frank Turner remarks, "An unrestrained passion infuses his pages and drives his argument, while an ornate, distant, unfamiliar rhetoric interferes with the persuasiveness of his presentation. In fact, it almost blocks our access to it." Burke's pulsating emotion and the rhetorical vehemence of his assault on the political violence in France press the reader to take refuge in the very rationality he denounces. On the other hand, Conor Cruise O'Brien plays down the criticism of rhetorical excess. He writes, "There is in reality very little rhetoric, quantitatively speaking. Most of the book is made up of plain, cogent argument. Whatever the merits of the claim and counterclaim in the context of Burke's essay as a whole, the passage just considered is not a page from a novel, nor yet a stanza of a poem, nor a leader in a newspaper of record, but is presumably a serious and rational attempt to reject mundane contractarianism as the root of the legitimacy of the political order. Shorn of its rhetoric, however, it appears to be entirely devoid of argument, amounting to a bare assertion that there is a great primeval eternal contract, in Burke's very special sense of that term, that demands our obedience. Where this contract came from, what its terms are, precisely why we are bound by it, none of these issues is explicitly articulated. Nor is it easy to see how Burke reconciles such sentiments with his commitment to Whiggery, with his apotheosis of the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, which, ironically, justified itself by charging James II with breaking the original contract between king and people. The best thing that can be said for this passage is that it contains a tacit pragmatic appeal to much the same fear that one finds at the root of Hobbes's Leviathan, namely, that without the state chaos ensues. There is a deep irony in this, given that it would be harder to find two thinkers more diametrically opposed to one another than Burke and Hobbes, and that what Burke deplored in his particular characterization of the policies of the new French government was their embodiment of the absolute state about which Hobbes had theorized. Commenting on this notorious passage, Sabine notes the conflation of the terms state and society, and he writes that this is a serious confusion of words, since society, the state, and government have certainly very different meanings. Moreover, the interchange served a rhetorical need in Burke's argument. By it, he implied that the revolutionary government in France, in overthrowing the monarchy, had become an enemy to French society, and was destroying French civilization. Doubtless, Burke meant to assert that this was true, but he had no right to cast the argument in a form that begged the question. Overthrowing a government and destroying a society are quite different things, and there are many sides of a civilization that depend very little on the state. Not everyone is as sceptical about the Burkean supercontract as I am. Jesse Norman remarks correctly that Burke's contract is very different from that of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and he regards it as extraordinarily interesting and powerful. One might be tempted to say that Burke's contract is different from those of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, simply because whatever their other merits or demerits, the contracts of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau are contracts, whereas Burke's contract isn't. But perhaps there is more to it than that. Burke, despite his talk of contracts, is actually much closer to Hume in holding that a contract, a real contract, not his metaphysical one, is unnecessary to ground political obligation, such obligation arising in some other way. I am in agreement with Burke in rejecting the contractual theories of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. I am in agreement with him in seeing de facto political orders as arising from a confluence of historical accidents, tradition, custom, caprice, and acquiescence. However, I see all this as merely an historical, matter-of-fact description of the status quo, not a justification. And the justification is just what is needed. What is perhaps defensible in Burke's thought, to a certain extent, is his reminder to us that human beings are not disembodied rational beings, but are fleshly creatures of experience, custom, habit, historical precedent, and religion, and that there is a perpetual danger that a concern with abstract rights runs the risk of dissolving these prior and necessary human roots that perform the constitutive role for man in his social identity that memory does for his psychological identity. Also, to his eternal credit, Burke was forthright in his condemnation of the contempt for property evidenced in the land confiscation and physical depredations of the revolutionary French government, believing that such contempt for property could not but extend to persons as well. Burke understood one's own personhood and body to be a mode of property, and thus considered that what had begun as confiscation of church lands could end in the deprivation of citizens' lives by the revolutionary state. Summary. Burke published his first work, A Vindication of a Natural Society, in 1756. The Vindication purports to demonstrate the evils that accrue to mankind from political society. Most Burke scholars treat the Vindication as a satire or a parody. Not everybody understood it to be satirical when it first appeared. William Goodwin, for one. Goodwin actually modelled the beginning of his inquiry concerning political justice on the Vindication. In recent years, Mary Rothbard has argued that the Vindication should be taken literally. Frank Pagano argues that the plot of the Vindication is essentially a critique of liberal theory. The underplot is a conservative defence of liberal practice. According to Pagano, Burke vindicates at one and the same time natural society and artificial society. Man is an inherently social being, living in and through society. Society is not simply an assemblage of individuals, but is permeated by institutions of various kinds, which institutions constrain, compete, and cooperate with each other, contextualize and shape people's lives, and act as repositories of artistic, technical, social, and political knowledge. Society, at bottom, depends upon attachments that precede reason and calculation, such as love of one's family and locality, and other attachments that radiate outwards from there into one's country and one's nation. Such attachments are constitutive of one's being. They are not chosen arbitrarily. For Burke, society is not a product of reason alone. It depends rather on instinct and obscure propensities, even on what Burke defiantly calls prejudices, by which he means judgments in advance of reason, not necessarily judgments opposed to reason. Politics for Burke is an art, not a science, and it requires prudence, experience, and knowledge of human nature. Burke thought that manners mattered more than law and even more than morals, inasmuch as both law and morals in large measure depend upon manners. It has been claimed that the revolutions that Burke supported all involved a struggle against specific wrongs, in particular against the arbitrary exercise of power. But the French Revolution was not of this kind. It was not an attempt to defend a particular way of life against aggression, but rather the wholesale destruction of particular ways of life in the pursuit of abstract and rootless rights. Despite his talk of contracts, Burke is actually much closer to Hume in holding that a contract, a real contract, not the metaphysical one, is unnecessary to grant political obligation, such obligation arising in some other way.